To explain the life of the Yost children, namely Jerry, Marilyn, Roger, and John. And it pertains to the relationship between Harold Yost and Edith McDowell, whose maiden name was Partial. Jerry and Marilyn both had input into this story because it starts out sounding like the story of my life, but it's merely my recollections. With their help, they filled me in on some of the things I didn't know about, or maybe I didn't have straight, or I just didn't remember. 60 years is a long time. My first recollection is in Cortland across from a feed mill, downstairs of a house with a front porch. Next to our house, a ditch running with water and an iron handrail on the sidewalk over top of that ditch. I remember someone in the upstairs apartment getting burnt with something scalding hot, and my family helping them to get out and get medical help. Can't picture my own family, but they had to have been Mom, Dad, Jerry, Marilyn, and me, because John wasn't born yet. Next place was a house on Ravenna Road in Newton Falls. The house had 2 floors with a closed-in sun porch on the 2nd floor. I remember a garage, and Jim Heber lived in a big house across the street. We had a toilet in the basement under the steps, where Marilyn showed me she could go standing up just like me. I started the 1st grade here and had to walk to school. We weren't allowed to follow the railroad tracks, but sometimes I did, and I got a licking for it. I remember my mother here running after the girls, and Brother John was born in this house. A bed was put in the den, and a lady came and stayed with us. The next recollection was the farm. Mr. Griffith owned the house on Ravenna Road and the farm in McClintocksburg, where we went when I was halfway through the 1st year of school. I don't know how long he lived here before Mother died, but she died in this farmhouse. Her body was in the living room for days. All the relatives came. I remember Aunt Miller sitting us all on the steps and talking to us about Mother. I distinctly remember my dad crying over the casket in the Wayland Church. And I also remember at the cemetery when they started to lower the casket into the ground. Brother John was hardly a year old. At this place we had to walk to the end of the road to catch the bus to school. In wintertime we almost froze waiting for the bus on somebody's porch. I cried a lot of times from the cold. Then my dad went to the school board and got the bus to come and turn around in our drive. One neighbor girl walked with us and boarded the bus at our place. Her name was Joanne Bright. We didn't like her, and she was dirty. Her parents had goats, and she smelled just like a goat. Her dad drank and was always bumming off of my dad. Sometimes my dad made him pitch manure before giving him money or food. One time, that Joanne and I got into a fight, and she kicked me in the mouth. My tongue must have been out, and I still have the scar on my tongue today. We had a large garden, and we all had to help in it. One day, Jerry and Marilyn didn't come out very soon after the dishes, and my dad went in to get them. The results of that wasn't very nice. We always had a milk cow and a couple of calves to feed, plus some pigs, and always a lot of chickens. The fields were done on the shares, but I remember him taking me out to a field to husk corn that had been shocked. I almost froze, and I remember crying, and I wasn't very big at that time. As soon as I could, I had to milk the cow morning and night and help feed the animals. I had to straddle the milk pail in order to carry it. The same with the pails of chicken feed. Dad worked at Republic Steel and left early in the morning. A swamp ran across the middle of the pasture, and that cow would stand in the middle if she didn't want to be milked. In the summertime, I would put on my swimsuit and wade out to get her. One day, my dad went to town and got a BB gun, and that worked for a while. I remember a calf starting to be born. Just the legs came out. I ran and told my dad. He grabbed a rope and sent me to the house. I wasn't allowed to watch. After he got it out, he called me to see it. The pigs would get out, and we'd have to chase them all over the neighborhood. Certain times a year, a man would come to butcher, maybe a cow and a pig. Neighbors would come from all over for different parts of the animals. One person wanted the organs, another the head, another the feet, and one girl always came for the eyes. The meat usually was canned, and large quantities of lard was made. I remember Dad rubbing salt into the hams down cellar on a big round table, but there was a dirt floor. There was a trap door outside on the porch that went down cellar, and another set of steps inside after you went through the pantry. Milk was stored in the pantry, and they would skim the cream off the top. I remember sitting up on the countertop with a square butter churn between my legs as I cranked the churn to make butter. I sure liked the buttermilk afterwards. Saturday, we always had to dress a bunch of chickens for a banquet or a wedding in town. Build a fire under a barrel of water to boil to scald the chickens. I would pull off the feathers. Sometimes Jerry and Marilyn had to help. My dad would gut them on a large table. I don't remember much playtime. Maybe the girls can remember. People would come any evening of any day for a chicken or eggs. I would be sent out to get a 5-pound chicken. I'd carry the scales and the hook to catch them with around the leg. A big rooster would chase me out of the chicken house. One time I threw the scales at him. We picked and stored apples and grapes and canned a lot of stuff out of the garden, and had a large potato bin down cellar. We saved the small ones for seed for the next year. I remember my dad getting a new car in 1937 Plymouth, I believe, and he and Shorty Root from Cortland making a homemade tractor from a Studebaker. I also remember starting that tractor one day and running it into the back of the garage, knocking it off foundation. I really got a beating for that. I remember the time I poked a stick in the crack of the granary where the bees went in and out, and I was attacked and I had lots and lots of stings on my head, neck, and arms. They plastered me with a lot of white stuff. I think my mom was still living then. After she died, we had several housekeepers come and stay. I remember one came. She had a daughter. She only was told about having 2 girls, but not about the 2 boys, so she only stayed one day. Then came Mrs. Metzenroth, her son and invalid husband. I know they had the downstairs bedroom because of him, and son Billy slept with me. He was older than me, and he picked on me all the time. I was afraid of him. Billy had certain chores assigned to him that he was supposed to do. One day he didn't do those chores. When my dad came home from work that night, he knew right away that some of the animals hadn't been fed. So he said something to Billy's mother, and his mother said, "What would you do to Roger if he did that?" He said, "Roger'd get a licking." She says, "Well, then you do the same thing to Billy." But he didn't do it. Mrs. Metzenroth was a meanie, too. She would smell our breath to see if we had lied about brushing our teeth, and smell our pants to see who left the stinker and lied about it. Her husband was a real nice guy. That house had 2 sets of steps to the upstairs, to the 2nd floor. There were 3 bedrooms up there. Once we were quarantined for measles, and once we had to move out to fumigate the house for bed bugs. I don't remember having any fun, and birthday parties were unheard of. I was bad one time, and I had to mow the yard before I could have any breakfast. I could hardly push the mower. The ongoing bad memory that I can't forget is all the beatings I got for wetting the bed. For years I did that almost every night, and every day I got the belt for it. I mean, every time. Billy would tell his mother as soon as we got up, she'd make me wash the sheets in the tub, and when they were wet, I could hardly lift them. She couldn't wait until my dad got home from work to tell him. As always, he'd look at me and say, "Go to the barn, I'll be out in a minute." I'd go to the barn. Soon he would come, take off his belt, tell me to lay up my glasses, and beat me as he had done so many times before. And he'd tell me that I'm lazy. He'd tell other people about my habit and say that he had me to the doctor, and the doctor said I was just too lazy to get up at night. The truth is, he never took me to any doctor. That went on for years. One day they were putting up hay in the barn and the fork got stuck. My dad climbed to the top of the barn to unstick it, and he fell, holding the rope all the way to the ground. And rope burned his hands. He told me that that was the only reason I didn't get the belt that day. Halfway through my 4th grade at school at Paris, we had to move. In spite of it all, I liked to farm. It seemed that the government had to build the arsenal, and a dairy farmer lost his farm to that. We were at war. That farmer bought our farm, so we moved back to Newton Falls on Broad Street. Mr. Metzenroth had died, so my dad took in Edie and her daughter Joanne. We later found out that they knew each other for years, lots of years. That explains the times that my dad would dress up and go out evenings while we lived on the farm. Sometimes he'd come back to the house before dark to get something, and he'd park the car out on the road and walk in. There would be a woman in the car. That happened even when my mother was still alive. Edie was to be our housekeeper, much to our sorrow. She kept house and was a good cook, but a mother she was not. And she spent a lot of nights in my dad's bedroom. That left Joanne in her bedroom by herself and the 4 Yost kids all over the house. After a while, Jerry slept with Joanne, and Marilyn was on a cot downstairs in the dining room. My younger brother, John, inherited my bedwetting, and I grew out of it. Edie assumed the position of Mrs. Metzenroth, only worse. She licked John every day and made him wash his sheets every day, and he could hardly lift him. My dad left her do it, too. At least he didn't beat him. I don't know which was worse. As the months and years rolled on, we didn't like our lives very much. Joanne was an only child, and her father bought her anything she wanted. My dad and Edie fought about this daily. Joanne had everything, and we had nothing, all living in the same house. Dad didn't let us be idle. Everyone had a job if he could get us one. I had to shine shoes uptown first, followed by several paper routes, plus he took the job cleaning the Masonic Temple, so I'd have something to do. I'd sweep the temple, plus the halls and the steps, and I'd fire the boiler on Saturdays, carry out the ashes up those long steps to the outside. My dad got $80 a month for this, and he gave me $20. Now, I don't remember him doing any of the work. I also sat pins at the bowling alley, among other jobs. A skating rink opened in Newton Falls, and Dad let us go the first day. I got pushed against the wall and broke my leg. It was summertime, so I got farmed to Grandma's house for 2 months. I didn't mind that, as they took good care of me. I worked a lot of puzzles, dried a lot of dishes for Grandma. I remember Grandpa took me down to the shop when the time came to take off the cast. He cut it off with a hacksaw. They put me in the tub, washed off all the dead skin. Back home in time for school, and more of the same kind of unhappy life, and Dad and Edie fighting all the time. Dad and Edie went out a lot and let Jerry watch us kids. Jerry was probably 14 or 15 at the time. One time when they were out, I scared Joanne so bad, just messing around, that she went into hysterics. Somehow someone got hold of Dad and Edie, and they came home. He took me down cellar, and the beating I got for that I'll never forget. Afterwards he brought me upstairs and made me pull up my shirt so Edie could see the welts. He was proud of the job he did that time. The next summer on my paper route, I got hit by a car at the end of our street. Crushed arm and cuts and bruises. Dad took me to Grandma's for the summer again. I had a good time with Grandma, Grandpa, and Aunt Dorothy, all giving me attention. We went to church, we went to Grange, and ice cream socials on the square in Fredericktown every Friday night. Of course, there were puzzles, and I got so I could dry dishes. I went with Grandpa a lot in the truck. Before these years of broken bones, I was farmed out to Grandma's house for the summers. After we first moved to town, I guess. So I already had a good relationship at Grandma's house, and it was fun to go there. I know that Marilyn, Jerry, and John didn't have any fun while I was gone. In a way, you might say I got to escape for at least a couple of months. I would spend a week at Grandma Yost's, and then a week at Grandma Bones, and a week at Grandma Yost's, and a week at Grandma Bones, and back and forth like that for a couple of months till I'd come back home. Later we moved to a bigger house on Arlington Road, 4 bedrooms and 1 bath. Of course, at each house we had a garden to take care of. Most of the time we each had a job of some kind. We walked to school and walked home for lunch, crossed the covered bridge 4 times a day. By this time we were in high school. Jerry and I worked in the A&P store. Marilyn worked at the telephone office and at Richardson's restaurant. Dad took half of everything we made to pay for our keep, and that didn't relieve us of our duties around the house. Dad worked at Republic Steel, but after we moved to this house, he went into the plumbing business. I had to work with him evenings, Saturdays, sometimes Sundays for free. One time we worked till midnight on a school night, and he gave me 4 quarters. Normally in the summer I got $4 a week. At least that was spending money. On those paper route years, and even later, I was supposed to save my share of my money, and then just before school started, He'd take me to Rose and Son in Warren to buy my school clothes. I suppose the girls had to do the same thing. As time went by, we worked more and more at plumbing, and I got paid less. He said people weren't paying him, so he couldn't pay me. I went 8 weeks one time without pay. He'd give me a couple of bucks once in a while for spending money, and I never did get the back money. He and Edie went out a lot, and they took a couple of vacations without us kids. The only fun I can remember is going to the Canfield Fair. Jerry and Marilyn feel the same way. Dad and Edie still fought daily about the same thing, Joanne getting everything, and us kids nothing. They always fought and argued and hollered at each other at the supper table. A lot of suppers were ruined, but we had to eat anyway. My dad got so mad one time he threw a fork at her so hard it stuck in her hip, and she had to forcefully pull it out. They always made up by Friday so they could go out. Marilyn's job put her into an apartment in town, and eventually Jerry got married. They escaped. I, on the other hand, was still at home, working for Dad and on midnight turn at Standard Steel Spring Company. They made automobile bumpers. A close friend of mine got into a bad auto accident in his car, and that was close to my girlfriend's house, and we heard the accident. We went to the site, and he was in bad shape and begged us not to leave him. So I went to the hospital in the ambulance with him, and I missed work. My dad was so mad when I got up the next morning. Edie told me that Dad wanted my car keys left at home and I could only drive to work, because he believed there is no excuse for missing work. He had signed for me to get that car, but it was all my money that bought it. I gave her the keys and told her to tell him if he wanted the car that bad, he could have it, and I left home at that point. Edie told us later that when he came home and found out, he went into a rage, busted up the house, including all of us kids' graduating pictures. She was afraid for her safety. That left Joanne and John at home. Edie continued to dote on Joanne, and her and my dad kept fighting about it. I don't know how life was for John after that. Eleanor worked at Fall Steel Tube and waited for me. She had a room at Mrs. Stroop's house on Ridge Road, and she walked to work, as she didn't have a car before we got married, and she went home on weekends. After we got married, she had my car as I was in the Army, and she stayed at home. Before I got out, she rented a house on Maple Street. After the Army, my dad talked me into working for him and said things would be different. They were, to the extent he didn't try to run my life, but he still had trouble paying me. Another man worked for him too, and he paid him every week, but lots of excuses why he couldn't pay me. Still, he had new cars, and he and Edie continued to have a good time. I knew little about income taxes and so forth at that time, and after 1 year I owed $200 in taxes because my dad didn't take enough out. It might as well have been $2,000, as Eleanor and I didn't have 2 nickels. John R. Davis made out our taxes, and he said if the employer didn't deduct enough, then it'd be his responsibility to pay it. I went to my dad and I told him that, and he said, tough. He wasn't going to pay it. Well, somehow we paid it and vowed never to work for him again. We moved to Newark and worked for Uncle Don's company at Westinghouse. It was like minimum wage, and after 2 years of barely existing, we came back to Newton Falls. I had a chance to finish my plumbing apprentice that I had started before I left. My dad thought I came back to go in business with him. He propositioned me to get a GI loan for $10,000 to invest in his business with him as a partner. For that, I would get $200 a week and 5% of the sales. Eleanor and I stayed true to our word and turned him down. Then we found out that he and Edie had been fighting like mad, so she didn't want me to have any part of the business. She was relieved when I turned him down. I went to work for a plumber in Cortland, and we moved to a duplex in West Mecca. My dad didn't visit us at all for years. Jerry and Marilyn visited with Dad and Edie some, but we were 25 miles from Newton Falls. John had quit school and gone to the Navy. Joanne got married. After I built the house in Mecca, Dad and Edie finally found where we lived and visited a couple of times. Edie never was friendly, but my dad and I started to get friendly, and that's when Edie would stop coming with him. He came alone, Or if John was home, he'd come with him, or other company, but Edie never would come with one excuse after another. We visited them once in a while, but never comfortable, as she was never happy to see us, and never any refreshments, and never invited to dinner, even though we'd had them for dinner before she'd stopped coming. Jerry and Marilyn visited them back and forth all those years till the same thing happened. Edie found excuses not to go with him. On the other hand, they noticed that Dad and Edie visited Joanne and her family often and had dinners together in both places. Dad went with her, but she would not go to see us with him. We used to take turns having the Yost Christmas, and eventually Dad would come alone and Edie would go to Joanne's. She didn't want any part of his family. He used to go to Marilyn's house Sunday mornings for breakfast, but Edie wouldn't go. After a considerable time, he didn't like going alone, so he quit going to Marilyn's too. It was after we all had left home that they finally got married. Years passed and Jerry or Marilyn would make plans to go to Dad's for dinner. All of us would take all the food and tell them we were coming. And we did that. But none of us were ever invited to dinner, and it was common for Joanne's family to be there for dinner. And they went to Joanne's a lot too, kids' birthdays and all. My dad didn't know any of my kids' birthdays, or mine for that matter. In the years later, my dad went through different illnesses and had to be driven to doctors and hospitals and drugstores and for all kinds of appointments for the bank, post office, and so forth. And Jerry and Marilyn would be available to drive, because Edie never did drive. This went on for several years. Edie would always blow everything out of proportion and make things, especially illness, seem much worse than they were. They had long since stopped any visiting with Yost kids or grandchildren for the most part, but some communication apparently went on with Phil and Linda as they were misled considerable. When Dad got real sick toward the end, Edie went into action with a certain lawyer in Newton Falls who I don't think did everything on the up and up. Somehow she got all CDs, accounts, properties, and so forth in her name. She immediately turned down all offers of rides from Jerry and Marilyn and relied on friends and neighbors even though the offers were there. She had secret meetings with a lawyer and with a friend or friends, visited my dad's deathbed, we believe, to have him sign over all she could. By law, she was entitled to 1/3 of his estate when he died. Dad had told Jerry and Marilyn that he had a $10,000 CD for each kid, but they were gone. They had sold the business for $56,000, plus their income the last 20 years he lived. They didn't go anywhere to spend money. She ignored Jerry and Marilyn completely after he died and moved real fast to auction off the contents of the house without asking any of us if there was anything we might want, and sold the house all within 3 months. I'd been through an estate settlement recently and learned that you couldn't finalize until 6 months had passed. She did it in a hurry. That raises my suspicions about the lawyer. She had a way to manipulate people, and I think she did that to the lawyer. She got $38,000 for the house. Maybe one of the grandchildren would have been interested in buying the house, but she ignored all the Yost side completely. We could have gone to court, and I'm sure changed things if she didn't already have it solely in her name, which I believe she did. She got him to sign off on his deathbed. So we might have been able to change it anyway. At the time, my wife was dying of cancer, and I was in no shape to fight. Jerry didn't want to, and Marilyn didn't want to do it by herself, which I didn't blame her. Brother John wasn't interested, and he lived in Georgia anyway. When I did go to the courthouse to read the will, I found that I was cut out of his estate. I truly believe she was responsible for that too, as I opposed her too much. In court, I'm almost sure things would have been changed. She was an expert liar and an expert at manipulating people. She did that to our dad. All of our growing up years, he was God. Nobody dared talk back to defend themselves, right or wrong. One time I got brave enough to talk back, and he knocked me clear down the cellar steps, caught me on the first bounce at the bottom of the steps, and he really beat me then. And yet she was able to turn this man around and destroy an entire family and walk away with the entire estate, free and clear. Jerry and Marilyn are supposed to share after Edie dies, but my guess is, if there's anything left, it will all be in Joanne's name. We told her to buy a tombstone for him, thinking that with all that money she'd buy a real nice one, and then we would buy one to match it for our mother. Well, she bought the cheapest one she could buy. She didn't even have any feelings for him after he was gone. I did not and could not include all of the gory details of the Yost kids, but even Uncle Don said one time that the Yost kids didn't have a very good life. Our mother was 29 when she died, and it wasn't until we moved to Broad Street that we learned that she died from childbirth. She didn't want any more children, as my dad was running around on her, so she tried to do something about it and died from it. Jack left Maryland, Bob died early, and so did Eleanor. John was married 3 times. The offspring of Jerry, Marilyn, and Roger all turned out okay, thank goodness. John has a son by wife number 1, but he hardly knows him. John hardly communicates with us, but we know he's okay. He never really had a mother. Only a witch is capable of doing what she did. As far as I'm concerned, she can't suffer enough. Jerry, Marilyn, and I are very concerned that maybe our children don't think we are very interested in Edie's welfare. We hope that this tape will help you understand why. Please pass this tape on to your brothers and sisters and then return to me.